Good morning, folks. Welcome. So, today we are going to be talking all things Black History Month, allyship in the workplace, and mental health, particularly those of racialized communities. And I'm excited to be joined by Yohan and Ben, who I'm going to let introduce himself shortly. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Bianca Jones, Managing Director of EDP Training, founder of the Race Ahead courses, and a mental health first aid instructor and associate trainer as well. Yohan, please introduce yourself, and then Ben, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Bianca. So I'm a mental health and wellbeing trainer, associate trainer for MHFA England since 2018. I've also been a trainer for Mind as well. I have my own training company, Great Minds, which delivers not just diversity and inclusion, but also manager training, a whole host of other training and consultancy as well. And one of the things that I do currently for MHFA England is I deliver a module on anti-racism training for new instructors. So it's a plenary session. It's about an hour and 15 minutes and gives them the tools, knowledge and confidence just to open a conversation, have some dialogue around anti-racism and race in the training sessions that those instructors may deliver.
Thank you, Yohan. Ben, over to you.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, my name is Ben Anderson. I'm the founder of a charity called Feeling Social. We deliver mental health first aid training, but we also deliver digital focused training alongside. So looking at the relationship between our phones and our well-being. My main area of focus is working with youth practitioners. So working with youth practitioners who then work on the ground with young people as well. And I've also been involved in the early days, I think during with Bianca. I think we delivered one of the first sessions, Bianca, but around the systemic racism module, which talks to new and existing mental health first aid trainers around how to have conversations about race throughout the classes.
Thank you, Ben. It's so great to have you two together and for us to actually talk about these topics. I'm so excited. So let's kick off because it is Black History Month, October every year. And this year's theme, 2025, is Standing Firm in Power and Pride. And I think it would be a really good starting place to think about what that means to us, so what Black History Month means to us personally or professionally. And I'll start with myself, and then you two can absolutely chip in. So when it says about standing firm in power and pride, it just reminds me of the resilience that is needed by the Black community to be constantly challenging, constantly campaigning, and fighting for social justice and equity. And I just can't help but think about the toll that resilience could take as well when we think about mental health. What about you folks? What does Black History Month mean to you?
For me, when I thought about that, three words come to my mind: history, heritage, and identity. And it's for me, one thing that I've learned having, doing the roles that I do now and having these conversations in the workplace, I've had to educate myself and realize that British history is Black history and Black history is British history. They're intrinsically linked. You can't separate them. So I've really enjoyed learning about actually my own history and the history of my father, who came from Jamaica in the 60s and part of the Windrush generation, and just how that's embedded itself in my own identity and my heritage. And I've had to, it's something I've had to learn to really embrace. When I was a child, you kind of just want to belong and fit in. I don't think I didn't feel like I did as much as I probably could do. But now I'm absolutely proud of my heritage. I shared that with my children. I took them to this year to Nottingham Carnival, and they just loved it and it's felt that kind of Jamaican connection, even though they're obviously born and bred in England and British, but they also feel that the power of that heritage, which I think is just, yeah, it's amazing to have, and they love it. And my daughter just loves being or having that kind of Jamaican element to her. She's so proud of it.
Oh, it's so important, isn't it? Knowing our history, and then we can be more proud and even more confident in a way as well. It's interesting what you said about Black history, because actually it's also something I say quite a lot, is it's white history as well. And that's something that we also need to acknowledge.
Mm. Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I mean, I've been brought up in London, my whole life. It's very small, a little part of my life that hasn't also been ingrained, within Black history and culture. I think it's really important. I mean, Black History Month as a celebration, but also making sure that it's not just a month that we focus on it, like with the work we're going to talk about in a little while, but within workplaces, making sure that we don't just shine a light after Black Lives Matter. And when and we're not performative around um the things we do in a workplace, but actually it's something that we do throughout the year. It's something that we ongoing and are constantly evolving with.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben. And mentioning there as well, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, which again was a time where the world stood still, paid attention, and was eager to learn. And we can't ignore that as a pivotal part, and as well as a catalyst. It was an important time. And let's reflect on that then. So, since the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, what progress has been made by workplaces, do you think, Yohan?
I think one of the things, it started a conversation. I mean, and that's the most important thing, I think, to recognize that people, because behavior doesn't change and people's mindsets don't change unless there's awareness. And starting a conversation, I think, can help generate awareness and education and understanding. And certainly that's one of the things which has happened. Obviously, on the back of that, which is where MHFA England asked and recruited trainers like myself to deliver the plenary sessions. And that's where I think it's now been a key part of a mental health first aiders instructors toolkit to start those conversations in the workplace, and they are happening. And every session I deliver, not just that type of session, but any session I deliver to any workplace, that what I find is that people want to talk about it. People love to talk about race. It's one of those topics which is it's a bit like Marmite. It's like it can feel really uncomfortable, but everyone wants to talk about it. Like people don't, people are fearful as well of talking about it. But actually, once you set the scene in the right way, once you put a group agreement in place and you give people the permissions to have these conversations in a respectful way, you can't shut people up. People do want to talk about it, and I think that is where the progression's been made. The conversation's happening. I think we're very early stages in terms of fundamental changes in the workplace, but it's now a topic which I think the senior leaders do have visibility of, and many are actioning that and implementing policy and practice change in the workplace, which I think is, once again, is how you start to really, really implement the structural and real changes that change people's behaviors.
I think you're right. Something that you said there about the awareness, that we might be biased here as trainers, but creating that safe space, having awareness, talking, I think that's a key to dissolve any fear or discomfort around having these conversations as well. Ben, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky enough. Most of the work that I do is working with youth practitioners in London. I work on a project called Rise Up, which is a multi-charity approach, and we work with young people across 28 of the 32 boroughs. It's leadership training, which also has mental health first aid as at the very heart of it. Now, I mean, some of the things when we were talking about the plenary that was created, I think something that really struck a chord with me was the mindsets, and challenging mindsets, the panic, fear, and stretch. Um, I think that's really important when we're talking about race, setting up the conversation where people can feel comfortable talking. I think what's beautiful with working with young people and youth practitioners is actually most of it is creating that and then giving space, you know, and making sure that a young person, a youth practitioner has the space to discuss these issues. One of the things that's come up and is quite humbling is that, like with a lot of the issues around intersectionality, language is evolving. It's certainly evolved since that last training in terms of even the words we use in the training. Language evolves exponentially, you know, and I think trying to make sure that at every point, certainly as an ally, I'm listening, willing to go with how people feel comfortable in the room and making sure people feel comfortable to actually feel like they're able to lead on the training as well. I think one thing I would say, which meant to be perhaps hopefully not critical, but more talking about what I think needs to happen, or we as trainers need to be quite hot on and advocate for, is to make sure that this conversation isn't performative. You know, it's not something we do because it's in the limelight at the minute. And actually, even when we're not in a particular month, or even years on from Black Lives Matter, make sure that it doesn't drop down big or doesn't become less of a priority. And I think that's been a challenge that I've seen quite a lot in organizations, in several environments. And yeah, it's I think it's an amazing, you know, I think it's an amazing conversation to have, especially when you focused. I think there is a challenge to try and make sure that is still front and center, even when it's not, you know, a priority in the news or a priority in, you know, in workplaces.
Love that. Keep it on the agenda. I
Mm.
think we can all agree from what you've said that it's definitely there. It's on the agenda. People are paying attention to it. People are talking about it. We've definitely moved on from the performative black squares, which were great, you know, as a visual demonstration, but black squares didn't do anything to actually, you know, dismantle racism. So I think we're definitely going into more action for many organisations, but there's still so much work to do, as you said, Ben. And from my lens, delivering training, race equity, the anti-racism and allyship to businesses, there is sometimes this feeling that they think it's going to be a one and done.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that it's ongoing. From language evolves, everything else is going to evolve. And when we spoke about BLM, we'll talk a little bit about where we are shortly, but it's forever evolving. Therefore, we're forever going to have this upskilling, safe space conversations and opportunities for people to talk and to continue learning. I think we've got a long way to go for the structural. I think the awareness piece is great for the interpersonal part of racism, the people to people racism. I think that with training and education, we could definitely make a big impact in that. But the structural is going to take more time for companies to really dismantle what is baked in over 400 years. It is going to take time, but they need to have the willingness, I think, to do that. And I think it's the structural part that's going to take longer, and the structural part that often gets left behind. So when I think about what more is there to do, I think organizations need to really focus on their policies, their procedures, what's excluding racialized groups, to really make a change.
And I suppose just on that, I mean, a lot of the work that I do is around digital and digital resilience. And I suppose in addition to the structural, I think it's really challenging for myself, for other people, for anyone online at the minute, you know, when we look at division. I mean, and I think that internal part, you know, that internal and also the interpersonal, the lines become a lot less blurred when, you know, there's what we see online, language which is used, it can be quite troubling. It can be quite troubling to tackle personally, but also thinking about how that, you know, that can also influence, you know, you know, a person and their views, you know. So I think language, I think the media, and I think social media has a lot to say, you know, has a lot to answer for today in this environment.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben. Yohan, anything to share for what still needs to be done from your kind of lens?
I mean, there's so many points there. I think one of them is around language, which I agree is so important. A phrase that I came across in the last year, which kind of had quite a bit of impact on me, but even references to groups that we're talking about. So the typical reference would be ethnic minorities, or BAME, so Black and ethnic minority groups. Then a phrase I heard recently, which kind of just changed my whole perception of it, which was global majority. Rather than ethnic minority. I mean, just the word minority in itself suggests you're just kind of a small, almost like insignificant group. Global majority, and it's a truthful representation, because actually there's more people on this planet who have black and brown skin than white skin. And that's not to say that's better or worse. It's just a factual element of it. But if you change your language around it, it suddenly has a different feel to it. And you touched a little bit earlier around the impact of that kind of onus to challenge inequity and racism, the impact it can have on individuals. But it really can have a negative impact and start to reduce your capacity to challenge it. So in terms of what needs to be done, it needs to be a collective effort. It always needs to start at the top. So in terms of organizations, there needs to be buy-in from the leadership team, but you also need buy-in from the bottom. So you need everyone involved. This is not just a nice initiative which is run from the HR department, and they put out nice posts on the intranet, and in Black History Month we talk about it. As Ben was saying, it needs to be throughout the year. It needs to be a consistent message. But there also needs to be, I think, this is the difficult part, uncomfortable conversations, because conversations around race and racism aren't comfortable. There can be really challenging to be had, and challenging for the person who's trying to conduct the conversation, but also challenging for the person who maybe experienced some discriminatory behavior based on race, that they feel that they have psychological safety, that they can talk about it. They are going to be listened to. They're not going to be spoken down to or felt gaslighted, made to feel that actually, look, it was just a bit of banter, or it was just a bit of fun, but actually they've been taken seriously. So it needs to be policy shift, and not just, like you said, not performative. It needs to be, this is something we do, this is who we are. You need to see it and I've gone into so many businesses where you've got the values and their kind of goals and visions on the wall, and you're like, wow, they sound really impressive. But how many of those are linked to the qualitative measures about people and how they feel, and that connection, that community which is needed for success? So I'm speaking quite broadly here, but that's where it needs to begin. It needs to come from the top, but it needs to be whole organization buy-in, and when you step into it, you need to be able to once again have those conversations which can challenge your own beliefs, your own identity. But that, and I think Ben touched on it earlier around the kind of, when you talk about race, you can feel stretched, or you can feel comfortable, or you can feel in panic zone. It's just about going with whatever you feel. Don't feel like actually you need to have all the answers, or you need to feel confident. Sometimes you just feel like I'm out of my depth here. But this is not about me. This is about listening to the people in front of you, how they're feeling and how it's impacting them. So yeah, quite a lot to think about.
A lot to think about, a lot to do. I think what I'm hearing is that companies really need to demonstrate it, and it needs to be cut across through every layer of the organization. And I think that's not what we've got to. We've got to the awareness, the education, people are aware, but definitely more work on the structural. The language is important, it's forever evolving, as we've mentioned. I think a company choosing what language they're going to use and the reasons why, and maybe putting it on their website, can also be useful to set the tone as well.
Well, MHFA England have got an inclusive language guide, which I think is a really great start. It just gives people a framework, some tools to work with, a starting point. But it's also about being able to say the wrong thing but learn from it, rather than be condemned from saying something. Look, give people a chance to learn, help them understand this language may not be so helpful. Consider saying it this way, going forward, that's what you need to be focused on.
Yeah. What you said about the ethnic minority and global majority, I often reflect, and I think, what age do we start ticking boxes? And I think, goodness, if at 15, 16, 17, I was ticking a box of global majority, what a difference that would have done for my mental health, my sense of belonging, rather than ticking actually ethnic minority. Because, like you said, that sends a message of smaller, less than, inferior, and everything else that's associated with that term. So language matters, it really does. And thinking about belonging, that brings us to the current events, which we can't ignore with the rise of, anti-immigration, the rise of hate. And a lot of companies are struggling to know what to do, how to respond, how to continue their race equity work, possibly. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about the message that is being sent at the moment and how safe people might feel. I know for myself, I drove down a street the other day which had it was a long road and it had about 30 flags down it. So if someone has, put those flags up, there was 30 lampposts. That's a lot of effort to demonstrate the message. And what that said to me was, I don't feel safe. I don't feel psychologically safe. And obviously, we can imagine the impact on our mental health, quality, and psychological safety as well. So, when we think about people in the workplaces, any thoughts around this, Ben, and then Yohan?
Firstly, that particular day of the recent day of the marches was heartbreaking. I'd been at a gig with friends the night before. It was a group called Two Fox. And there was such a sense of unity in that space. I remember one of her main lines was like, "This is what London sounds like." And it was a million miles from the next day and what woke up to. And I think sometimes we can be certain, just talking to ourselves, can be guilty of being in a bubble and not seeing these things happen on the outside, or not seeing them fester, whether it's online or in communities. I think there's a lot of fear right now. A lot of people who have perhaps been um, moved towards the right wing or into more extreme views, perhaps because, and several reasons, perhaps because they haven't been able to express openly, or just perhaps because of the role of media and social media and different elements today. But certainly, uh, I like to think that not everyone going to those marches are there for the same reasons, and some feel disillusioned and some don't. But it was heartbreaking just to see, and I think it moves the conversation around systemic racism into also looking at the country's approach to what is British, and the migrant experience, and I think there's so much fear around what's going on today, and I think that was just I'm only talking about the ones in London in particular, but for me that was particularly hard because or it was particularly shocking, shall I say, just because yeah, I think sometimes when working with youth practitioners, when it's in personal environments, when you don't realize what's going on outside of your bubble, and it shows we've got a lot more to be done. I think one of the things you mentioned, Bianca, was the idea that we might be sitting in the workplace with several people that have gone to the marches. I was surprised looking on my Instagram or social feeds around friends of friends and extended networks who were posting pictures there. And I think, you know, finding a way to try and challenge or at least start the dialogue around those groups, I think is really important. But don't have all the answers, but it was a shocking time, and I think it shows maybe another angle or the need for this systemic racism module to be expanded, and to be looking at, um, yeah, to be looking at like cultural equity and the migrant experience in London, sorry, in the UK, and just challenging that.
Oh, thanks for sharing, Ben. And, I'm with you. The message that this sends is fear. And, as we know, we talk about mental health a lot, and that fear can really affect someone. It can lead to depression, anxiety, feelings of feeling anxious, of low, sad mood. Yeah. Yohan, anything to add about the current climate and the workplace?
I think firstly to think about what does a flag actually mean? What does it symbolize? Because I mean that there's no inherent meaning to the flag at all. It's just a Union Jack or St George's Cross. And so for me, it's about the motivations behind it. Like as you said, that street with 30 flags in it. What motivated that person to climb at a lamppost, spend their time and energy buying it, putting it up? So is it a motivation? Is it a symbol of inclusion or is it a symbol of division?
I guess it's the rhetoric behind it, isn't it? Which at the
Right.
moment is saying exclusion, anti-migration message behind it.
Right, and that's what for me. I don't see. I mean, firstly, I consider myself as British. So
Me too.
that flag is as much my identity as anybody else's who claims to be British. But I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and for me, the early symbol of British identity or linked to the Union Jack was unfortunately National Front using it, and then it moved on to other groups, EDL and other groups. But unfortunately it's got links to the far right in that element. But I try and look at it from a position of is it patriotism? Is it that I'm proud of my nation? I'm proud and I want to show that, because actually I think that's a brilliant idea. I really love that idea, and I think we should all put up flags and embrace it and enjoy it, because that's the thing that can connect us. But it's the absence of any other behavior, which I think is where it leads a question mark as to the motivations of it. In other words, is there any behaviors where people are connecting their communities, bringing people together, looking out for others, embracing people's life challenges, and embracing British values, which is around tolerance and understanding and caring for others. But I don't see that. I don't see that behavior, and so for me, it questions the motivation behind it, which I think is challenging, and only people can truly answer that themselves. But sometimes even then, what they see is what their beliefs around. They like Ben was saying, that there's fear, and they feel threatened. And I think you said earlier, we do need to listen to that. Where's that coming from? Why is that feeling there? And because yes, we're talking about things that happen on the street, but this is absolutely going to show up in the workplace, because that's where we all spend a lot of our time. And it does concern me as to if you've got that really divisive mindset, what does that do to how you engage with your colleagues at work, or how you behave around customers? How do you speak to your team? How do you lead an organization? It's kind of, and unfortunately, it leads me to see that there's a direct link between that mindset and the natural outcomes in the workplace now of inequitable outcomes for Black people and people of color, in terms of
Absolutely. And so, like you, I identify as British. And I do think that there are people that are raising the flags to celebrate their British values, but I think that that's probably the minority in this kind of affront to inequality, unfortunately. I think, sorry, Ben.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I find it difficult with the England flags, even the British flags. I think it's hard to raise that without acknowledging British culture, but also going back in time and looking at England and Britain as an oppressor, right? You know, so what are you holding up when you're saying I'm proud to, you know, to raise the England flag? I think there was a lot about trying to, you know, certainly with those marches, a lot of maybe what the motivations for some people was to reevaluate or regain what it means to be British. And I think certainly that was a thinly veiled way, you know, or for some people to justify it. I think in reality, when you saw the sort of environment on the ground, it was much more than that, you know, and maybe so I hope some people were misled, if you like, to go on as much, and perhaps, you know, the fallout is a lot more you know, I think the reality of the situation was it was much more about you know, there was much more racial undertones to it. But yeah, I do struggle with the flags, certainly. My family is Scottish, and you know, I've been taught quite from birth about, you know, about what it means to be English, and sometimes some of the you know, the sort of oppressive connotations to those flags. I think it comes out of football matches. I mean, it comes out at times like this. Um, but yeah, it's certainly, I think it's worth having those conversations. I think which is mentioned, and just going like, why are you raising them? But very rarely is it about celebrating us celebrating this country. Often it's a mark of oppression, or it's a mark of, you know, invoking fear on other people.
Thanks. That's a really good point. And I think it comes back to the intentions as well. I mean, if people are like, I just want to celebrate my British values, but what are they? What is that? What's behind that? Is it that you're saying your British values are anti-black and brown skin people? So it's what's behind that for somebody. And that message, I think, as you've mentioned, fear quite a bit as well. It does send a message of fear of not belonging, which is the very thing that we need as humans.
Mhm.
And it makes me reflect of the time of Black Lives Matter movement as well, and that vicarious trauma when we saw somebody being murdered, and what message that sends to people who still have to get up the next day and go into the workplace. There are people currently going into a workplace where, as Yohan said, there could be people that are of that mindset and belief and have been on a march. And yeah, what can we do in the workplace at the moment for allyship in Black History Month for our Black colleagues, but also for racialized minorities as well?
Was that a question?
Yeah. What can we do in the
Oh,
workplace?
okay. So I mean, there's lots of things. Firstly, is to give people the the psychological safety that they can speak up about it. So, in other words, if they do raise a concern, so maybe there's some inappropriate language used, or some behaviours that someone doesn't feel comfortable with, or whether they've noticed someone else behaving in a certain way, or it was something they said and someone challenged them on it. But they're people are given the safety to be able to, and mechanisms to report and just air their concerns and have a discussion, and but also give people the, once again, the psychological safety, because that's what it comes down to, the confidence that if they do challenge it, you know, they're not going to be condemned by the people involved or the organization, but they're going to be listened to and taken seriously, and it's not going to be, you know, gaslighted, and it's not just going to be lip service either, because once again, going back to my earlier point, there's policy and practice which supports it. You know, it says, no, this is not who we are, and that behavior is not in line with our values and who we are, and we're going to challenge it on that level. But but the other thing as well, what we need to remember is that it's great to promote and have allies, but I think it's also important not to put the onus on Black people and people of colour in that role solely. There needs to be right representation there as well, because it, you know, it can be like I can't think of another word other than double jeopardy. Then if you're fighting the inequalities and inequities, and that can have a burden on you, having to lead on initiatives which challenge that can have a double impact and what's going to double burden on you and have an impact on your own well-being. So it's so important to, yes, have those roles in place, but there also needs to be the support that goes with it. It's so important that they feel they're not on their own, and if they, even things like just driving initiatives, even things like, focusing on Black History Month, saying like we are going to talk about this. It's not just their voice, it's the leader's voice, which is also heard, because they're saying, no, this is who we are. And I believe that's where you start to get behavioral change, cultural change, which starts to work towards that, inclusive work culture, which is best for everybody. Everyone will thrive in those kind of environments.
Absolutely. And I think that permission as well, that we are all in this and everyone has permission to be able to challenge constructively, so that we can have, more inclusive and more equitable organizations. But what you said as well, if you are already from a minoritized community, and then the onus is on you to speak up, and then often you're reporting maybe to someone above you statistically who's not going to look like you. There's the hierarchy and the power imbalance, there's the trust, there's the am I going to be taken seriously? A lot of people report mechanisms that are in place they don't trust, or they feel that it's going to be punitive, or they're going to lose their job for reporting. There's definitely a big piece around safety. And I think that sometimes the receiver of, microaggressions, racist behavior, discriminations, often don't want to report it because they often feel like so disempowered. What's the point? So I think allies, we can really have them to help and to support and to speak up when the person can. And I think I would encourage anyone to speak up and to be able to challenge and be able to log discrimination or behaviour that they see or hear or witness. I think we definitely need all allies to be given that permission to step up, to make that change as well. Ben, anything for allies in the workplace
A
at the
couple of
moment?
things, I suppose, certainly looking at the parallels between mental health and, systemic racism, inclusivity. I think a big challenge previously, should I say, or maybe ongoing, was to try and promote that mental health isn't just something you should be addressing in the workplace, but it's something that when you do, there's a huge return on investment. I think there's a £1 for every £1 you spend on workplace well-being, you get £5 back in productivity retention. I think when we look at inclusivity in the workshop in the workplace as well, it's not just something as an organization should be doing, but an inclusive workplace environment is a healthy one. It's essential. I think it goes beyond quotas, but actually more about like having diversity in the workplace, but actually even when it comes to decision makers, even when it comes to the structural elements of the business, making sure that it goes deeper than just hiring, or having representation in the workplace. I think just as an ally, I think I remember back in the, when we were looking at Black Lives Matter and when we were doing these courses, and we were doing the courses to current mental health first aiders and beyond. I felt the challenge of wanting to learn and wanting to listen and wanting to evolve and grow, but not putting that pressure on the individual, and making sure that when people are helping to shape the approaches, or shape, the culture, that actually they're not doing it just because they're a person of color, but actually they're doing it, they're actually being rewarded or being employed or being given the resources to do it. So I think perhaps within workplaces, certainly the proactivity I think is important. doing it beyond surface level and doing it towards the root of your organization, but also, understanding the value or understanding the value in like cultural shift and the value you should put on people who are helping you evolve.
Thank you very much. Love that. So we've spoke a lot about the messages, the subtle but very overt messages that were being sent at the moment, the belonging, the fear. Where can we signpost our Black colleagues for help and support around the quality of their mental health? If there's somebody that feels that perhaps it's deteriorating, they're not feeling great, where can we signpost people? What can we encourage people to do? Yohan, then Ben.
So there's lots of organisations out there who have an empathy towards the Black experience. So organisations like Black Minds Matter UK, I think, is a great organisation for that. I've worked with them. But they also can put you in touch with resources and things like counselling service, which therapists who have an understanding of the cultural experience that and the challenges that someone of the Black community may experience. So that can be so important when you're having that kind of session, to have that representation. A really great I've got one more, but then a really great resource is also, it's called the Hub of Hope. So if you've done mental health first aid, the Hub of Hope is a kind of well-being directory services in the UK, and you can search specifically on sort of cultural resources particular to your challenge. So if it's race, if it's racial identity, and then you can search for that, and that can bring up a list of services across the UK. There is one more which I'll point out, called the Black African and Asian Therapy Network, which is more specific once again to getting that representation of someone who may just be able to empathize your experience. So rather than having to explain, and this is what I went through, this is how I feel, they can connect with that on that level, and I think that can give people a sense of comfort and belonging, and that could be a big step forward. And I'm saying this from people I've spoken to who wouldn't necessarily trust authority, but they'd want to go down a path where they feel that actually the people they speak to can understand them and their situation.
Love that. And their cultural and social norms. And if you're sat in front of someone who looks like you, a lot of the trust element can be done already, particularly in the therapeutic space. Thanks for those excellent resources. Ben.
Yeah, firstly, I think that's a really important message that we talk about within mental health first aid, but also within the therapy space, that actually it's not always the type of therapy, it's a relationship or the bond you build with someone. And sometimes that can only be done if it's someone who shares your experience, or has an experience of that. I suppose coming from a youth perspective, a lot of the work that I do on Rise Up is with youth practitioners. I'd say two organizations which stand out there is Power to Fight, which have a range of amazing trainers around London, but around the UK as well. Another organization, someone who came through the Rise Up program and then set up their own CIC around this topic, is a person called Zaid Bimboga. She also set up an organization called We Are Displaced, and it's delivering cultural sensitive workshops around race and cultural equity. So yeah, someone I'd really recommend who is tackling and is tackling it with a fresh approach. There are two that I would recommend personally.
Thank you, Ben. Sounds like great work as well that you're doing. Okay, so don't forget about the workplace. There is more culturally appropriate support being added to employee assistance programs. Of course, line managers as well, if you feel comfortable to talk to line managers, and mental health first aiders, of course, who are trained to be able to listen and support and encourage and signpost. So please, please, please open up a conversation, talk to a mental health first aider in the first port of call as well. The Mental Health First Aid England website also has some great resources. There's one called Supporting Your Black Colleagues, and there is another great resource document about supporting your racialized communities as well in the workplace that could be really helpful right now for people. Okay, so let's leave off with a message to our allies during Black History Month. What would be a key message for allies during this month? Anything that you would want to say to them? Yohan, I'll start with you, and then Ben.
I think it's kind of like, it's maybe just something that I noticed in you. When you talk about this topic, you smile a lot and you kind of enjoy the topic, and I can see that, and I love it too, and I think it's part of the message. Embrace it, enjoy that journey, because I think it's such a powerful and important one, and just embrace the challenge that comes with it. Because yeah, and I say to my kids, the best way of learning is to make mistakes, and to is to make and do things which you have to learn from. But that's where we grow, that's where we progress as a people. And so enjoy it. Yeah, that's the other thing. Enjoy it, make mistakes, don't try and get it all right, because there is no right. And because I think you said at the top of the session, language is changing all the time, but behaviors are changing all the time. Our policy and practice, the way we approach it, is changing all the time. So it's kind of like, okay, let's just try and do the best we can with what we've got, and that's great. That's enough. That's going to help really move things forward. And I take my hat off to you in doing that well. I think that's so crucially important, and it's a voice which needs to be heard.
Thank you, Yohan. Ben, message to allies.
I love that. And I think I just like to second that as well. Firstly, just we talk a lot throughout the group agreement, or when we talk through mental health first aid, we talk about a very highly stigmatized topic of mental health. And one of the first things we'd say is try and enjoy the training, try and ask silly questions. I think that notion of discussing quite weighted topics, but being able to do it in a comfortable and light-hearted, but one which we can actually connect as humans. I think just to go back to, and I think you've touched on it, Yohan, but that mindset, the panic, comfort, and stretch. If ever I feel comfortable around the topic of systemic racism, I know that I'm not up to date. If ever I feel panicked or I feel targeted, I know that I'm approaching it wrong. I think the stretch mindset is so important, knowing that we're all responsible to learn and to grow with it. We're responsible to ask questions, but also come to a point where we're educated and we're as up to date as possible. And I think, like what you said, Yohan, I think we will all make mistakes, and we might use language which was in date a month ago, last time we delivered training, and someone feels uncomfortable with it today. I think just making sure that we're not resistant to that, and that whenever we're challenged, or whenever someone adds to our frame of reference, or talks about their own, I think being comfortable and being proactive about discussing it. So yeah, I think really just focusing on that stretch part, and making sure that we're proactive and we're excited to evolve with this topic.
Love that. Which leads on to my key message to allies, which I think, as much as Black History Month is fantastic, it shines a light, and I really enjoy being able, as you know, to talk about these topics during this month. It's a catalyst, and it should be used as a catalyst. It shouldn't be a one and done. It should be ongoing. And I encourage all allies to do their own learning, because actually, and I might be biased as an instructor and a trainer here, but the awareness, as Yohan said as well, I feel is the most important thing, the awareness, the education, because actually that dissolves the discomfort, which so often works as a tool to stop people from talking on this topic. And then if we have knowledge from the awareness, that also then builds confidence. And when we have confidence and awareness coupled together, we then can turn that into action. And that's where the actionable part of allyship comes in, which is really needed at the moment to help turn the tide on racism. So my ask is that all allies do some self-development and some ongoing learning to really mark Black History Month in a meaningful way. So I want to say a big thank you to Yohan and Ben for joining me for this session. It's been really insightful, and I just want to give an absolute round of applause. I take my hat off to you folks, because you are out there, we are out there, we're doing the work in this space, and it's not always easy. It can take its toll on us, right? So I just want to say, well done, keep it up.